Now, 2 millimeters might not sound like a big deal, but when it's a hole aboard the International Space Station, it certainly is. And to plug the gap, an astronaut has had to cover it with his finger to avoid air pressure dropping. That's until some sealant and duct tape was found. It's understood that the incident happened when a tiny little fragment of rock or other material hit the Russian section of the space station. Well, joining me in the studio is Wimmer. It's not every day I get an astronaut here in Austerlitz. Thank you very much for coming in to talk to us. How dangerous is this kind of hole or tear in the space station?
Well, it is potentially quite dangerous. Even that little hole, 2 millimeters, which is nothing, if that were to be left untouched, it would only take 18 days and the astronaut would be dead.
Really?
That's how serious it is. 2 millimeters. Imagine the big space station, which is the size of a football pitch, with a little tiny hole like that. 18 days, there's no more air.
Mind.
It's incredible.
They think that this could have happened with a tiny little fragment of rock. I mean, presumably that happens all the time.
Space is very dangerous, and actually not just little rocks, but also, more importantly, space debris. There's a lot of stuff we have left as human beings up there, sadly. I know Sky News has a big push on picking up plastic in the oceans, which I commend a lot.
So
I think that's great.
But
up there you basically have 23,000 known objects of stuff, little stuff, satellites that have collided or space debris that's been left behind.
So we litter all over the place.
Absolutely, and space is very littered. Since 1957, we have, as human beings, sent up 5,250 space missions, but we have only today about 1,200 active satellites up there. So the others are kind of left hanging there, sitting there, and sometimes these things collide. And there was a big collision, for instance, on 10th of February 2009, where a Russian military satellite collided with an American Iridium satellite. And they hit each other head-on with 42,000 kilometers an hour. Can you imagine? And lots of splinters and lots of stuff thrown out of that.
So
and in fact,
the chances of this happening then are quite high. What about the remedy? I mean, it seems so incredibly crude, doesn't it, for something that is high technology up there in space, an astronaut sticking his thumb in it before some tape can be found. Is it really that crude?
Well, that was the quick solution. Put the thumb in, and then afterwards some duct tape over it, and then obviously later they'll use some slightly more advanced methods to plug it up. But the reality is, whilst the space station is sort of geared for that sort of thing, it can happen. And bearing in mind, this was just a 2 millimeter fragment. Of all the 23,000 known objects out there that are larger than 1 centimeters, there are also some bigger pieces, and if they were to hit, my God, that's a very serious event.
You need a big thumb then.
Yes, you need a big shield.
And how is something like that detected, only 2 millimeters on something the size of a football pitch?
Well, the way they detected it was NASA keeps from the ground and a good control over what's happening with the air pressure, the oxygen levels and everything, and thankfully for that, because the astronauts were actually sleeping when this happened.
Right.
So can you imagine?
So they're monitoring
all this stuff from down. So fortunately, there's a great backup crew downstairs, and they saw suddenly that the oxygen levels were starting to drop. So it's like, here's a problem. And then they started a little bit of a fact-finding mission by shutting off various compartments of the space stations, and eventually managed to find that little tiny hole where it was coming from.
And as an astronaut, I mean, how much panic does that cause if you're up there?
It's a serious situation. I mean, space debris and little rocks that can hit you, I mean, those are real dangers, so that's not to be played with. Having said that, it's not something that happens every day. In fact, it happens quite rarely. But if it were to happen, because of the speed, these little fragments travel faster than the bullet of a pistol.
Right.
So you can imagine, it's also dangerous when you go for spacewalk. Imagine if you get hit by a screwdriver that somebody left behind. It'll go straight through you.
Totally boggles my mind. And the bit that got damaged, that's the bit that's going to get dumped in space, isn't it? What about the maintenance of the craft that's going to be coming back to Earth? Because that's got a big job to do.
Yeah, so typically what you do in order to sort these problems out, I mean, you fix the problems as much as you can on the spot. If you need to let things go, you try to slow down the speed to basically take them down closer to Earth. And as it gets closer to Earth, the friction starts to hit in and they burn. So So you hope most of it will kind of burn, and you try to, if it's a controlled mission, like when the Mir space stations are being taken down, you take it down over the Pacific Ocean or some place where you're not going to hit anybody with it, because there's usually a little bit of fragments left at the end of the day.
OK, well, it's fascinating to talk to you. Could talk to you all morning about it. Thank you ever so much for coming in, Per Wimmer there. That's it for me.